Sarah Chin sat in the corner of the university library, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to focus on her psychology textbook. The words seemed to blur together on the page, not because of poor eyesight, but because of the anxiety that constantly gnawed at her stomach. At 22, she looked younger than her age, with her small frame, oversized glasses, and the nervous habit of tucking her long black hair behind her ears when she felt overwhelmed. The whispers started again from the table behind her. "Look at her shaking." Madison's voice carried just loud enough for Sarah to hear. How is she even supposed to become a therapist when she can barely talk to people herself? The cruel laughter that followed made Sarah's cheeks burn with embarrassment. Madison Torres was everything Sarah wasn't. Tall, confident, and popular, she commanded attention wherever she went. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes made her the unofficial queen of the psychology program. She had gathered a group of followers who seemed to feed off her cruel humor, and for the past 6 months, Sarah had become their favorite target. "Maybe we should offer her some therapy sessions," Jessica, one of Madison's friends, added with a snicker. "She clearly needs help with that anxiety disorder." Sarah's fingers gripped the edge of her textbook so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the chair, and never have to face another day of this torment. The other students in the library either ignored the situation or pretended not to notice, leaving Sarah to endure the harassment alone. Professor Williams had assigned a group project worth 40% of their final grade, and somehow Sarah had been placed with Madison's crew. It was supposed to be random selection, but Sarah suspected Madison had manipulated the process somehow. The project required them to design and present a comprehensive treatment plan for a fictional client with complex trauma. "We should meet at my apartment tonight to discuss the project," Madison announced loudly enough for half the library to hear. "That is, if Sarah can manage to speak up during our meetings. We can't have dead weight dragging down our grades." Sarah's stomach churned. She had been dreading this moment since the groups were announced. The thought of spending hours with Madison and her friends, being subjected to their constant mockery, made her feel physically sick. But she needed this grade. Her scholarship depended on maintaining her GPA, and she couldn't afford to let her team down, no matter how cruel they were to her. "I'll be there," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "What was that?" Madison cupped her ear dramatically. "You'll have to speak up if you want to be part of this group. We can't hear mouse squeaks." The laughter erupted again, drawing annoyed looks from other students trying to study. Sarah felt her face burning with humiliation as she repeated herself slightly louder. "I said I'll be there." "Good girl," Madison said with mock approval. "Maybe we can work on your confidence issues while we're at it. Consider it free therapy." As evening approached, Sarah found herself standing outside Madison's off-campus apartment building, her palms sweating despite the cool October air. She had changed clothes 3 times, settling on a simple sweater and jeans that she hoped wouldn't draw any additional ridicule. Her backpack was carefully organized with all her research notes, color-coded tabs, and multiple backup plans for their project. The apartment was exactly what Sarah had expected. Sleek, modern, and expensive, clearly funded by Madison's wealthy parents. The living room was spacious with a large sectional sofa, a massive television, and abstract art that probably cost more than Sarah's entire semester's expenses. Madison, Jessica, and 2 other group members, Kevin and Ashley, were already there when Sarah arrived. They were lounging on the sofa with drinks in hand, looking completely relaxed while Sarah stood awkwardly by the door. "Look who finally showed up," Madison said without looking away from her phone. "We were starting to wonder if you chickened out." Sarah mumbled an apology about traffic and carefully took a seat on the edge of an armchair, her posture rigid with tension. She pulled out her notebook and pen, ready to contribute despite the hostile environment. "So," Kevin said, leaning back with a beer in his hand, "Madison was telling us about your little anxiety problem. Is that why you want to be a therapist? Planning to fix yourself first?" The group erupted in laughter, and Sarah felt her chest tighten. She had learned long ago that defending herself only made things worse, so she remained silent and tried to focus on the task at hand. "Actually," Sarah said quietly, "I think we should start by reviewing the case study parameters. We need to identify the primary trauma, secondary symptoms, and potential treatment modalities. Madison finally looked up from her phone with an exaggerated expression of surprise. Oh my God, she actually spoke. And, in complete sentences. She turned to the others with mock excitement. Did everyone hear that? Our little mouse found her voice. Ashley giggled and pulled out her phone to record. Say something else, Sarah. This is actually kind of amazing. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. Can we please just focus on the project? There she goes again. Jessica clapped her hands together. It's like watching a nature documentary. The timid creature emerges from her shell. Kevin stood up and walked over to Sarah's chair, looming over her small frame. You know what your problem is? You act like a victim all the time. No wonder people walk all over you. Sarah's heart was racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. I just want to do well on this project. It's worth 40% of our grade. Relax, Madison said, waving her hand dismissively. We've got this covered. You can just sit there and take notes while the competent people handle the real work. For the next 2 hours, Sarah endured constant interruptions, mocking comments about her ideas, and deliberate exclusion from important decisions. When she suggested using evidence-based trauma therapy approaches, Madison dismissed it as textbook garbage. When she offered to research specific treatment protocols, Ashley said they didn't need amateur-hour contributions. Despite the hostility, Sarah continued to take detailed notes and offer thoughtful suggestions, most of which were ignored or ridiculed. She had spent years developing the ability to compartmentalize her emotions and focus on the mission at hand, though her tormentors had no idea where that skill came from. You know what? Madison said as they were packing up their materials. I think Sarah should handle all the research and reference formatting. It seems like busy work that's perfect for someone at her level. The others nodded in agreement, clearly happy to dump the tedious work on Sarah while taking credit for the creative aspects of the project. Sarah simply nodded and gathered her things, eager to escape the toxic environment. As she walked back to her small studio apartment across campus, Sarah's mind wandered to a different time and place. She thought about the obstacle courses in the mud, the grueling physical training, the mental conditioning that had forged her into something far stronger than anyone at this university could imagine. Her apartment was sparse and functional, a stark contrast to Madison's luxury. A single bed, a small desk, a kitchenette, and very few personal items. What decorations she had were carefully chosen and meaningful. A small American flag on her desk. A photograph of her graduating class from basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, though she kept it turned face down in a drawer. A few books on psychology and trauma recovery that went far deeper than her undergraduate coursework required. Sarah sat at her desk and opened her laptop, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. She began researching advanced trauma treatment protocols, drawing on knowledge that went far beyond her undergraduate education. She had lived through experiences that most people only read about in case studies, and she understood the complexities of psychological trauma from both academic and personal perspectives. As she worked late into the night, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Madison and her friends had no idea who they were really dealing with. They saw a nervous, quiet girl who seemed like an easy target. They had no way of knowing that she had once been part of the most elite fighting force in the world, that she had faced down enemy combatants in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The bullying stung, but it was nothing compared to what she had endured during SEAL training or in combat zones. She had chosen to leave that life behind, to pursue her dream of helping others heal from trauma, but the skills and mental toughness remained. She just hadn't found the right moment to reveal who she really was. That moment, she sensed, was coming soon. The next morning brought another psychology lecture, and Sarah found herself sitting in her usual spot near the back of the classroom. Professor Williams was discussing complex PTSD and its treatment approaches when Madison's voice rang out from the middle of the room. Professor, don't you think some people are just naturally suited to be victims? Like, maybe some personalities are just weaker and more prone to psychological problems. Sarah's stomach clenched as she realized Madison was setting up another public humiliation. Several students turned to look at her, clearly understanding the not-so-subtle reference. Professor Williams frowned slightly. That's an interesting question, Madison, but it reflects some common misconceptions about trauma and resilience. Trauma can affect anyone, regardless of their baseline personality or apparent strength. But surely some people are just more fragile than others. Madison pressed on, her voice dripping with false innocence. I mean, look around this room. You can tell who would crumble under pressure and who would rise to meet challenges. More students turned to stare at Sarah, who kept her eyes fixed on her notebook. She could feel the familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck, but underneath it was something else. Something colder and more controlled. Actually, Professor Williams said firmly, research shows that many trauma survivors demonstrate extraordinary resilience and strength. Some of the most capable and courageous people I've known have been those who've overcome significant challenges. Madison wasn't deterred. But what about people who seem to just accept being bullied or pushed around? Doesn't that show a fundamental weakness of character? The classroom fell silent except for the scratch of pens on paper and the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this thinly veiled attack. For a moment, she considered speaking up, defending herself, or calling out Madison's obvious targeting. But, instead, she simply continued taking notes, her handwriting neat and controlled despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. After class, Madison approached Sarah as she was packing up her books. The campus recreation center was nearly empty at 6 in the morning, which was exactly how Sarah preferred it. She had discovered this quiet time slot during her first week of classes, when the weight room was deserted except for a few dedicated athletes and early risers. It allowed her to maintain her physical conditioning without drawing attention to capabilities that might raise uncomfortable questions. Sarah moved through her workout routine with mechanical precision, her movements economical and purposeful. Push-ups, pull-ups, burpees, and bodyweight exercises that most people would find exhausting but felt like meditation to her. She kept the weights moderate and avoided the more advanced exercises that might showcase her true strength. As she finished her cardio session on the rowing machine, Sarah noticed someone watching her from across the gym. It was Jake Martinez, a senior from her abnormal psychology class who had always seemed different from the typical university crowd. He was older than most students, probably mid-20s, with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested military experience. Jake approached as Sarah was wiping down the equipment. "Mind if I ask where you learned to row like that? Your form is textbook perfect." Sarah felt her guard go up immediately. "Just picked it up here and there," she said quietly, avoiding eye contact. "That stroke rate and technique doesn't come from here and there," Jake said with a slight smile. "I did 4 years Navy before coming back to school. I recognize military PT when I see it." For a moment, Sarah's carefully maintained composure almost cracked. It had been so long since someone had spoken to her without mockery or condescension, and the recognition in Jake's voice was both comforting and terrifying. "I don't know what you mean," she said, shouldering her gym bag and preparing to leave. Jake held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Hey, no judgment here. Whatever your story is, it's yours to tell or not tell. I just wanted you to know that if you ever need someone who gets it, I'm around." Sarah paused at the gym entrance, looking back at Jake who had returned to his own workout. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have someone to talk to who understood the weight of secrets and the difficulty of transitioning from military to civilian life. But the risk was too great. Her past needed to stay buried. Later that morning, Sarah found herself in the university's student services office, waiting to speak with her academic advisor about course selection for the following semester. The waiting area was small and cramped, with uncomfortable plastic chairs and outdated magazines scattered on side tables. The door burst open with unnecessary force, and Madison swept in with Jessica, close behind. They were both dressed in expensive workout clothes and carrying yoga mats, clearly coming from some trendy fitness class. "Oh, perfect," Madison said loudly when she spotted Sarah. "Look, Jessica, it's our favorite group project partner. How's that research coming along, Sarah? I hope you're not planning to turn in anything as pathetic as your usual contributions." Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the psychology journal in her lap, trying to block out the approaching confrontation. The waiting room had several other students who were now watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. Jessica plopped down in the chair directly across from Sarah, invading her personal space with deliberate aggression. You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about your whole anxiety thing. Have you considered that maybe you're just not cut out for this field? I mean, how can you help other people deal with trauma when you can barely function yourself? Maybe she should switch to something easier, Madison added, settling into the chair next to Jessica. Like library science or accounting. Something where she doesn't have to interact with actual human beings. Sarah's breathing remained steady and controlled, but her hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the magazine. She had learned long ago that showing any reaction would only escalate the situation. Are you even listening to us? Madison snapped her fingers inches from Sarah's face. It's so rude to ignore people when they're trying to help you make better life choices. A middle-aged woman at the reception desk looked up with concern. Is everything okay over there? Oh, we're fine, Madison called out with false sweetness. Just having a friendly conversation with our study partner about her career goals. Sarah finally looked up, meeting Madison's eyes directly. I appreciate your concern, but I'm satisfied with my major choice. The quiet strength in Sarah's voice seemed to catch Madison off guard for a moment, but she quickly recovered. Satisfied? That's exactly the problem. You're settling for mediocrity instead of facing reality. And what reality is that? Sarah asked, her voice remaining calm and level. Madison leaned forward with a cruel smile. That you're weak. That you'll never be able to handle real psychological crises because you fall apart when people look at you sideways. Your clients would eat you alive. Jessica nodded enthusiastically. She's right. Can you imagine trying to counsel someone with serious trauma when you can't even stand up to a little friendly teasing? Sarah set down her magazine carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. You think what you're doing is friendly teasing? Oh my God, Madison laughed. Are you actually going to try to stand up for yourself? This should be entertaining. The receptionist was watching the exchange with growing concern, but before she could intervene, Sarah stood up smoothly from her chair. Her posture was suddenly different, more centered, and balanced, though the change was subtle enough that most people wouldn't consciously notice it. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Sarah said quietly. You seem to believe that my quiet nature indicates weakness or inability to handle difficult situations. Madison and Jessica exchanged glances, surprised by the shift in Sarah's demeanor but not yet understanding its significance. Are you trying to tell us that you're actually tough? Madison stood up as well, using her height advantage to loom over Sarah. Because from where I'm standing, you look like the same frightened little mouse you've always been. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying Madison with the kind of calm assessment she had once used to evaluate potential threats in hostile environments. What do you think makes someone strong, Madison? The question seemed to throw Madison off balance. What? I'm curious about your definition of strength, Sarah continued in the same level tone. Is it the ability to intimidate people smaller than yourself? The willingness to attack someone who doesn't fight back? The capacity to make others feel bad about themselves? Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair, sensing that the dynamic in the room had somehow changed. We're not attacking anyone. We're just being honest about your limitations. Sarah turned her attention to Jessica, and the younger woman actually flinched slightly under the steady gaze. And what limitations would those be? You're scared of everything, Jessica said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. You can barely speak up in class or defend yourself when people call you out. I see, Sarah nodded thoughtfully. So in your opinion, strength means being loud and aggressive? It means ensuring that everyone around you knows how powerful you are. Madison was beginning to look genuinely unsettled. There was something in Sarah's tone and bearing that she couldn't identify, but it was making her deeply uncomfortable. What are you getting at? I'm trying to understand your perspective, Sarah said simply. Because in my experience, truly strong people rarely feel the need to demonstrate their strength by belittling others. The waiting room had gone completely quiet. The other students were watching the exchange with fascination, sensing that something important was happening, but not sure exactly what. Madison's face flushed with anger and confusion. Are you actually trying to lecture me about strength? You, who jumps every time someone raises their voice. Sarah's expression remained calm and thoughtful. I've noticed that you seem to interpret my quiet responses as fear. That's an interesting assumption. Because that's what it is. Madison's voice rose, drawing concerned looks from across the office. You're terrified of confrontation. Am I? Sarah asked mildly. Or am I simply choosing not to engage with behavior that I find beneath my standards? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Madison's mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to process what she was hearing. This wasn't the same frightened girl she had been tormenting for months. Your standards? Jessica laughed nervously. What standards could you possibly have? You don't even have standards for yourself. Sarah turned her attention back to Jessica, and again the younger woman seemed to shrink under her gaze. I have very high standards, actually. For my academic work, my physical condition, my professional goals, and the way I treat other people. Your physical condition? Madison laughed harshly. You're like 5 feet tall, and probably weigh 100 pounds soaking wet. Physical strength isn't always about size, Sarah replied calmly. Just as mental strength isn't always about volume. Before Madison could respond, the door to the inner office opened, and Sarah's advisor called her name. Sarah gathered her things with the same careful precision she brought to everything else, then paused to look back at Madison and Jessica. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, she said quietly. But I don't think you'll find it by trying to tear other people down. As Sarah disappeared into the advisor's office, Madison and Jessica were left sitting in stunned silence. The other students in the waiting room were staring at them with expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval. What the hell just happened? Jessica whispered. Madison was asking herself the same question. For months, Sarah had been the perfect victim, quiet, submissive, and apparently helpless. But the person who had just walked into that office was someone entirely different. There had been something in her eyes, in the way she carried herself, that suggested depths Madison had never suspected. Meanwhile, in the advisor's office, Sarah was discussing her course load for the following semester with Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a kind woman in her 50s who had always been supportive of Sarah's academic goals. You're doing exceptionally well, Dr. Reynolds was saying as she reviewed Sarah's transcript. Your grades are outstanding, and your professors speak very highly of your work. Have you given any thought to graduate school? Sarah nodded. I'm definitely interested in pursuing a doctorate in clinical psychology with a focus on trauma therapy. That's a challenging field, Dr. Reynolds observed. What draws you to trauma work specifically? For a moment, Sarah considered how to answer that question honestly without revealing too much. I think I have some insights that might be valuable to people who've experienced difficult situations. Dr. Reynolds studied her young advisee with interest. There was something about Sarah that had always intrigued her, a maturity and composure that seemed beyond her years, combined with a depth of understanding about human resilience that was unusual in undergraduate students. I've noticed that you seem to have a particular understanding of stress management and crisis response, Dr. Reynolds said carefully. Your papers on post-traumatic growth have been remarkably sophisticated. Sarah chose her words carefully. I've done some independent reading in the field. Dr. Reynolds nodded, sensing that there was more to the story but respecting Sarah's privacy. Well, whatever your background, you're clearly well suited for this work. I'd be happy to help you research graduate programs when you're ready. As Sarah left the Student Services building, she reflected on the morning's events. The confrontation with Madison had been inevitable, and she was pleased that she had handled it without revealing too much about her true capabilities. But she sensed that Madison wouldn't let things rest there. People like Madison didn't respond well to having their worldview challenged, especially by someone they considered beneath them. That afternoon, Sarah found herself in Professor Williams' office hours, ostensibly to discuss their upcoming group presentation, but actually hoping to gain some perspective on the increasingly difficult social dynamics in her program. How are things going with your group project? Professor Williams asked as Sarah settled into the chair across from her desk. It's challenging, Sarah replied diplomatically. Professor Williams raised an eyebrow. Challenging how? Academically or interpersonally? Sarah hesitated. Professor Williams had always struck her as someone who genuinely cared about her students' welfare, but Sarah was reluctant to come across as a complainer or victim. Some personality conflicts, she said finally. Oh. Professor Williams leaned back in her chair, her expression understanding. Madison Torres can be quite forceful in group settings. The comment surprised Sarah with its directness. You've noticed? I've been teaching for 20 years, Professor Williams said with a slight smile. I notice most things that happen in my classroom, including the fact that certain students seem to enjoy making others uncomfortable. Sarah felt a wave of relief at having her experiences acknowledged by someone in authority. I don't want to cause problems or seem like I can't handle normal social dynamics. Sarah, Professor Williams said gently, what Madison and her friends are doing to you isn't normal social dynamics. It's bullying, plain and simple. The validation felt like a weight lifting from Sarah's shoulders. For months, she had questioned whether she was being too sensitive or reading too much into innocent interactions. I've been thinking about switching groups, Sarah admitted. The group meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the library's collaborative study room, and Sarah arrived early to set up her materials. She had spent the entire week preparing for this moment, carefully crafting a presentation of her research that would demonstrate her knowledge without revealing too much about its source. Her laptop contained a comprehensive analysis of complex trauma treatment protocols that went far beyond what was typically expected for undergraduate coursework. She had synthesized information from military psychology research, combat stress control techniques, and cutting-edge therapeutic approaches that most students wouldn't encounter until graduate school. Madison arrived 20 minutes late, flanked by Jessica and Ashley, their arms loaded with coffee cups and bags from expensive campus restaurants. They seemed surprised to find Sarah already there, with neat stacks of printed materials arranged on the table. Well, look at this, Madison said with mock impressed. The mouse actually showed up early. And what's all this? She gestured dismissively at Sarah's organized research materials. I put together some background research on evidence-based trauma interventions, Sarah replied calmly. I thought it might strengthen our treatment plan. Kevin arrived a few minutes later, immediately gravitating toward Madison's end of the table and pointedly ignoring Sarah's materials. The group dynamics were exactly as Sarah had expected, a clear division between the popular students and the outcast. Okay, let's get this over with, Madison announced, pulling out her phone to check messages. Sarah, I assume you've got all the boring reference stuff handled? I have comprehensive research on several treatment modalities, Sarah confirmed, including some approaches that might be particularly relevant to our case study. Jessica laughed. Approaches you learned from what, Wikipedia? We don't need amateur hour suggestions. Sarah's expression remained neutral. Actually, I'd like to share what I found. I think you'll find it interesting. Without waiting for permission, Sarah opened her laptop and began displaying her research on the room's projector screen. The first slide showed a detailed breakdown of complex PTSD symptomatology that immediately captured the group's attention with its professional quality and sophisticated analysis. Madison looked up from her phone with a frown. Where did you get this? I compiled it from multiple peer-reviewed sources, Sarah replied, advancing to the next slide. I thought we should base our treatment plan on current best practices rather than basic textbook approaches. The next several slides outline treatment protocols that combine cognitive behavioral therapy with somatic approaches, mindfulness-based interventions, and exposure therapy techniques. The level of detail and clinical sophistication was far beyond anything the other group members had prepared. Kevin leaned forward, studying the screen with growing interest. This is actually pretty advanced stuff. Where did you learn about EMDR therapy and somatic experiencing? Independent research, Sarah replied simply, advancing to a slide that detailed the neurobiological impact of trauma on memory processing and emotional regulation. Ashley had stopped scrolling through her social media and was now paying full attention to the presentation. Wait, this diagram of neural pathways. This looks like graduate-level neuroscience. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her voice remained steady. I find the biological aspects of trauma response particularly interesting. Madison was no longer looking at her phone at all. She was staring at the screen with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Sarah, this isn't undergraduate-level work. How do you know about military psychology protocols? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had been hoping to avoid this particular line of inquiry, but she had known it was a possibility. Military psychology is well documented in academic literature, Sarah replied carefully. Combat-related PTSD research has contributed significantly to our understanding of trauma treatment. But you're citing specific protocols from military treatment facilities, Jessica pointed out, her voice no longer carrying its usual mocking tone. These aren't general academic sources. Sarah advanced to the next slide, which outlined a comprehensive treatment timeline that integrated multiple therapeutic approaches with specific milestones and assessment criteria. The level of practical detail suggested hands-on experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "How long did it take you to put this together?" Kevin asked, his tone now genuinely curious rather than dismissive. "I've been working on it throughout the semester," Sarah replied, which was technically true though not the complete story. Madison stood up abruptly, walking closer to the screen to study the details more carefully. "Sarah, this isn't student work. This looks like something a professional clinician would develop." The accusation in Madison's voice was clear, but Sarah maintained her composed demeanor. "I take our assignments seriously." "This is beyond taking assignments seriously," Madison snapped. "This is beyond what any undergraduate student should be capable of producing. Either you're cheating somehow, or you're not telling us something important." Sarah felt the familiar tension building in the room, but this time it was different. Instead of being on the defensive because of her perceived weakness, she was now under scrutiny because of her demonstrated competence. "I don't understand what you're suggesting," Sarah said quietly. "I'm suggesting that there's no way a nervous little mouse like you produced this level of work without significant help," Madison replied, her voice rising with anger and confusion. "Who did you get to write this for you?" The accusation stung, and Sarah felt a flash of genuine anger for the first time in months. She had poured her expertise and experience into this research, drawing on knowledge that had been earned through some of the most challenging training and real-world application imaginable. "I wrote every word myself," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new edge that made the others pause. "Prove it," Madison challenged. "Explain how you know about crisis intervention techniques used in combat situations. Explain how you understand the psychological impact of life-or-death decision-making under extreme stress." Sarah realized she had reached a crossroads. She could continue to deflect and minimize her knowledge, maintaining her cover but allowing Madison to question her integrity. Or she could demonstrate exactly how deep her understanding really went. "You want me to explain combat psychology?" Sarah asked, standing up from her chair with fluid grace. "Fine." She advanced to a new slide that showed a detailed breakdown of the stress response system under combat conditions. When someone faces immediate mortal danger, the sympathetic nervous system triggers a cascade of physiological changes. Adrenaline and cortisol flood the system. Time perception alters. Fine motor skills degrade while gross motor function is enhanced. Her voice was no longer quiet and hesitant. It was clear, authoritative, and filled with the confidence of someone speaking from direct experience. Heart rate can exceed 200 beats per minute. Tunnel vision occurs as the visual field narrows to focus on immediate threats. Auditory exclusion can block out all sounds except those directly related to survival. These aren't theoretical concepts. They're measurable, predictable responses that occur in every high-stress situation. The room had gone completely silent. Madison was staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, while the others watched the transformation with fascination and growing unease. "The psychological aftermath depends on multiple factors," Sarah continued, advancing to a slide that detailed post-incident trauma responses. "Training level, previous exposure to violence, social support systems, personal resilience factors, and the meaning the individual assigns to their actions." She turned to face Madison directly. Someone who has never experienced genuine life-threatening situations might assume they understand stress and trauma. But until you've had to make split-second decisions where hesitation means death, until you've had to function effectively while people are actively trying to kill you, your understanding remains purely academic. Madison's mouth opened and closed without sound. This wasn't the frightened, submissive girl she had been tormenting for months. This was someone entirely different, someone with knowledge and experience that went far beyond classroom learning. "Sarah," Kevin said slowly, "what exactly is your background?" Sarah realized she had already revealed far more than she had intended. The professional knowledge, the confidence, The way she spoke about combat situations, it was obvious to anyone paying attention that her expertise came from personal experience rather than textbook study. I've done extensive research in trauma psychology, she replied. But the deflection sounded weak even to her own ears. Bullshit, Madison said flatly. Research doesn't give you that kind of detailed understanding. You talk about combat stress like you've lived it. Sarah felt the walls of her carefully constructed civilian identity beginning to crumble. She had spent 2 years building a new life, creating a persona that would allow her to pursue her goals without the complications that came with her military background. I think we should focus on completing our project, Sarah said, attempting to regain control of the situation. No, Madison's voice was sharp with determination. I want to know who you really are. I want to know where this knowledge comes from. And I want to know why you've been pretending to be something you're not. Jessica leaned forward, her earlier mockery replaced by intense curiosity. Have you been in the military? Sarah's silence was answer enough. The group exchanged glances, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. That's why you're always here so early, Ashley said suddenly. That's why you move like you're always ready for something. That's why you never react when people mess with you. Sarah felt exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since leaving the teams. These people who had dismissed her as weak and insignificant were now staring at her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. What branch? Kevin asked quietly. Army? Marines? Sarah's training screamed at her to maintain operational security, to deflect and redirect, to protect sensitive information. But she was tired of hiding, tired of being underestimated, and tired of allowing people to question her integrity. Navy, she said simply. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Madison was studying Sarah's face with newfound intensity, as if trying to reconcile the quiet, nervous girl she thought she knew with this revelation. What did you do in the Navy? Madison pressed. Sarah met her gaze directly, and for the first time in months, Madison was the one who looked away first. Special operations, Sarah replied, her voice carrying a finality that discouraged further questions. But Madison wasn't ready to let it go. The power dynamic had shifted too dramatically, and she was struggling to process the implications. Special operations, Madison repeated slowly. Like what exactly? Sarah's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Like the kind of work that teaches you how to function under pressure. The kind that gives you real perspective on what actual strength looks like. The words were delivered quietly, but they carried an unmistakable challenge. Madison's face flushed as she realized the implication, that months of bullying and intimidation had been directed at someone who could have stopped it at any time. So this whole helpless victim act has been fake? Madison's voice rose with anger and embarrassment. You've been playing games with us? Sarah's composure was absolute as she replied. I've never pretended to be a victim. I simply chose not to respond to childish behavior with aggression. The distinction was lost on Madison, who was now feeling humiliated and defensive. You made us think you were weak. I never told you I was weak, Sarah replied calmly. You assumed that because I didn't fight back, I couldn't fight back. There's a difference. Kevin was studying Sarah with professional interest. What kind of special operations? Sarah's hesitation lasted only a moment before she made her decision. Naval special warfare. The room went dead silent as the implication sank in. Jessica actually gasped audibly. You're a Navy SEAL? Ashley whispered. Sarah's nod was barely perceptible, but it confirmed what they were all thinking. Madison stared at her in shock, her mouth hanging open. For months, she had been bullying and belittling someone who was part of the most elite fighting force in the world. That's impossible, Madison said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. Women can't be SEALs. Women have been eligible for special operations roles since 2016, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Integration has been gradual, but it's happening. The statement confirmed what everyone was already beginning to believe. The nervous, quiet girl they thought they knew was actually one of the most highly trained warriors on the planet. How many people know? Kevin asked. Here? Just my advisor, and now you, Sarah replied. I came to college to start a new chapter, not to be defined by my military service. Madison was still struggling to process this information. Everything she thought she knew about power dynamics, about strength and weakness, about who deserved respect, and who didn't, had been completely turned upside down. Why didn't you tell us? Jessica asked, her voice small and confused. Sarah looked at each of them in turn, her expression thoughtful. Would it have changed how you treated me? Would you have been kinder if you knew I could probably incapacitate all of you without breaking a sweat? The question hung in the air, forcing them to confront their own behavior and motivations. Word spread quickly through the psychology department, as secrets always do in small academic communities. By Friday morning, Sarah could feel the shift in how people looked at her as she walked across campus. The whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, the curious glances, the mixture of awe and discomfort that followed her through the hallways. She had anticipated this reaction, which was exactly why she had kept her background secret for so long. People treated veterans differently, especially female veterans, and particularly those from elite units. Some viewed them with hero worship that was equally uncomfortable as the previous dismissal. Others seemed intimidated or suspicious, unable to reconcile their preconceptions with reality. Sarah found refuge in her morning workout routine, arriving at the gym even earlier than usual to avoid the crowds and curious stares. She was halfway through her rowing session when Jake Martinez appeared on the machine next to her. "So," he said conversationally, "I hear you've been holding out on me." Sarah's stroke rhythm didn't change, but she glanced over at him with a slight smile. News travels fast. In a psychology department? Lightning speed. Jake matched her pace easily, his own technique suggesting extensive experience with military PT. "SEAL, huh? That's impressive." "It was a long time ago," Sarah replied, though that wasn't entirely true. She had transitioned out only 2 years earlier. "Not that long, judging by your conditioning." Jake's tone was respectful, but curious. "What made you decide to get out?" Sarah considered how much to share. Jake's military background made him safer to talk to than most civilians, but operational security habits died hard. "Wanted to do something different," she said finally. "Help people in a different way." Jake nodded, understanding the non-answer for what it was. "Fair enough. Must be weird having it all come out now." "Weird is one word for it," Sarah agreed, finishing her workout and beginning her cool-down routine. "For what it's worth," Jake said, "maybe it's better this way. Hiding who you are is exhausting." Sarah paused in her stretching, struck by the truth of his observation. She had been exhausted, not physically, but emotionally and mentally. The constant vigilance required to maintain her civilian persona, the careful monitoring of her reactions and knowledge, the deliberate suppression of skills and instincts that had become second nature. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Maybe it is." Later that morning, Sarah found herself in Professor Williams' office for what had started as a routine check-in but was clearly going to become something more significant. "I heard there was some interesting discussion in your group meeting yesterday," Professor Williams said carefully, studying Sarah's face for reactions. Sarah had been expecting this conversation. Some things came to light. "I see." Professor Williams leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Would you like to talk about it?" "I'm not sure what you've heard," Sarah replied cautiously. "I heard that you have a more extensive background in trauma psychology than your transcript might suggest." Professor Williams' tone was neutral, giving Sarah room to decide how much to reveal. Sarah made a decision. Professor Williams had always been fair and supportive, and if her secret was already spreading, it was better to control the narrative. "I served in the military before coming to college," Sarah said. "I gained some practical experience with trauma and crisis intervention." Professor Williams' eyebrows rose slightly. "What kind of military service?" "Naval Special Warfare," Sarah replied, watching carefully for Professor Williams' reaction. To her credit, Professor Williams' expression remained professionally neutral, though Sarah could see the surprise and interest in her eyes. "That's quite a background," Professor Williams said slowly, "and explains a great deal about the sophistication of your academic work." "I hope it doesn't create any problems," Sarah said. "I've tried to keep my military experience separate from my academic life." "Why?" Professor Williams asked, genuinely curious. "That kind of experience could be a tremendous asset in this field." Sarah sighed, feeling the weight of months of careful concealment. "Because people make assumptions. They either think I'm damaged and unstable, or they put me on a pedestal I don't want to be on. I wanted to be evaluated based on my academic merit, not my military service." Professor Williams nodded slowly. I can understand that. But, Sarah, you should know that your military background could significantly strengthen your graduate school applications. Admissions committees value diverse experiences, especially in trauma-focused programs. I've considered that, Sarah admitted. But I'm not sure I'm ready to make it public. That's entirely your choice, Professor Williams assured her. But I hope you'll think about it. Your unique perspective could help a lot of people. After leaving Professor Williams' office, Sarah headed to the library to work on her individual assignments, hoping to find some peace in the familiar routine of research and writing. But even the library felt different now. She noticed people watching her, whispering to their friends, pointing in her direction when they thought she wasn't looking. She was deep in reading about cognitive behavioral therapy techniques when Madison appeared at her table. Sarah looked up to find Madison standing there with an expression that was difficult to read, part embarrassment, part curiosity, and something that might have been respect. "Can I sit down?" Madison asked, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her, curious about what Madison wanted to discuss. Madison sat down carefully, as if she was afraid of making sudden movements. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly. The words were unexpected, and Sarah studied Madison's face for signs of insincerity or manipulation. "For what specifically?" Sarah asked. Madison's cheeks flushed. "For everything. For the way I've treated you. For the things I said. For making assumptions about you." She paused, struggling with words. "I was wrong." Sarah closed her textbook and gave Madison her full attention. This conversation felt important in a way that went beyond personal grievances. "Why do you think you were wrong?" Sarah asked. Madison looked confused by the question. "Because you're not who I thought you were. Because you're actually, you're a SEAL. You're incredibly accomplished and strong, and I treated you like you were weak and pathetic." Sarah leaned back in her chair, understanding now what was happening. "So you're apologizing because you found out I'm capable of violence?" "No," Madison protested, then paused, clearly struggling with the complexity of her emotions. Maybe. I don't know." "Madison," Sarah said gently, "if I had never served in the military, if I really was just a quiet, anxious psychology student, would I have deserved the way you treated me?" Madison's mouth opened and closed several times as she grappled with the question. I don't. "The answer is no," Sarah said firmly. "No one deserves to be bullied or belittled, regardless of their background or capabilities. My military service doesn't make me more worthy of respect than I was last week." Madison's eyes filled with tears, and Sarah could see her struggling with genuine remorse. "You're right. I know you're right. I don't understand why you didn't fight back. Why you let us treat you that way when you could have stopped it at any time." Sarah considered the question carefully. Several reasons. First, because violence should be a last resort, not a first response to social conflict. Second, because I wanted to see if I could handle civilian life without relying on my military training. And third, because I was hoping you would eventually realize on your own that your behavior was wrong. "But we didn't," Madison said miserably. "We just kept getting worse." "Some people learn from experience," Sarah replied. "Others need more direct feedback." Madison wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What you did yesterday, showing us your real knowledge, letting us understand who you really are, that was direct feedback." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "Sometimes the best way to teach someone about strength is to demonstrate it clearly." "I feel so stupid," Madison admitted. "And embarrassed. And scared, I guess." "Scared of what?" Madison hesitated. "Scared of what kind of person it makes me that I enjoyed hurting someone I thought couldn't fight back." The admission was painful but honest, and Sarah respected Madison for making it. "The fact that you're questioning your behavior shows that you're capable of growth," Sarah said. "The question is what you're going to do with this insight." "I don't know," Madison said honestly. "I've never really thought about why I do the things I do. It just felt natural, I guess. To be in charge, to make sure everyone knew where they stood." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Leadership through intimidation is one approach. But it's not the only one, and it's rarely the most effective." "What would you suggest?" Madison asked, and for the first time in their acquaintance, her question seemed genuinely humble. "Start by examining your motivations," Sarah replied. "Ask yourself whether your actions are making situations better or worse. Consider whether the power you're wielding is being used to build people up or tear them down. Madison was quiet for a long moment, absorbing these suggestions. Is that what they taught you in the military? Sarah smiled slightly. Among other things, military leadership principles focus heavily on taking care of your people, developing their capabilities, and accomplishing missions through teamwork rather than dominance. That's not what I would have expected, Madison admitted. Most people have misconceptions about military culture, Sarah replied. They assume it's all about aggression and hierarchy. But effective military units require tremendous trust, cooperation, and mutual support. Jessica appeared at their table, looking nervous but determined. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said quietly. But I wanted to apologize too. Sarah looked up at Jessica, seeing genuine remorse in the younger woman's expression. I feel terrible about how we treated you, Jessica continued. I've been thinking about it all night, and I realized that I was just following Madison's lead without really considering whether it was right or wrong. That's an important realization, Sarah said. Personal responsibility means making your own ethical choices, regardless of group pressure. Ashley arrived a few minutes later, followed by Kevin, until Sarah found herself surrounded by her former tormentors, all looking uncomfortable but determined to make amends. We talked about it as a group, Kevin explained, and we realized that we owe you more than just individual apologies. We owe you an explanation of how we're going to do better going forward. Sarah was impressed despite herself. This level of self-reflection and accountability was more than she had expected from any of them. We want to restart our group dynamic, Madison said. We want to actually listen to your ideas and treat you as an equal partner in this project. More than equal, Ashley added. Your research is better than anything the rest of us have produced. We should be learning from you, not dismissing you. Sarah looked around the table at their earnest faces. These were the same people who had spent months making her life miserable, but she could see genuine change beginning in their attitudes and behavior. I appreciate the apologies, Sarah said, but the real test will be whether your behavior changes consistently, not just when you know I have the capability to defend myself. You're right, Madison agreed. And we want to prove that we can be better than we were. Sarah nodded slowly. Then, let's finish this project together. And let's make it something we can all be proud of. As the group began discussing their presentation plans, Sarah reflected on the strange turns her civilian life had taken. She had come to college seeking anonymity and a fresh start, but perhaps complete concealment had never been sustainable. Maybe Jake was right that hiding who you are was ultimately exhausting and counterproductive. For the first time since starting college, Sarah felt like she might be able to be herself. Not just the quiet student persona she had constructed, but the complete person she actually was. It was a frightening and liberating possibility. The week leading up to their presentation flew by in a blur of productive collaboration. The group dynamic had transformed completely, with Madison and the others deferring to Sarah's expertise while contributing their own strengths to the project. They met daily to refine their treatment plan, practice their presentation, and integrate their different perspectives into a cohesive whole. Sarah found herself enjoying the academic collaboration in a way she never had before. Without the constant undercurrent of hostility and dismissal, she could fully engage with the material and share her knowledge without fear of ridicule or suspicion. The transformation in the group was remarkable to observe. Madison, freed from the need to constantly assert dominance, revealed herself to be quite intelligent and insightful. Jessica showed a talent for organizing complex information into clear, understandable formats. Ashley demonstrated creativity in developing practical applications for theoretical concepts. Kevin brought analytical skills that strengthened their evidence-based arguments. By the time presentation day arrived, they had created something genuinely impressive. The presentation began with Madison providing an overview of their fictional client, a female veteran who had served multiple combat deployments and was struggling with complex PTSD, survivor's guilt, and difficulty transitioning to civilian life. As Madison spoke, Sarah noticed how her former tormentor's entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the aggressive confidence that had masked insecurity, replaced by genuine professional composure. Jessica followed with a detailed analysis of the client's symptoms, drawing on the group's research to explain the neurobiological basis of trauma responses. Her presentation was clear and well-organized, demonstrating that when freed from the pressure to perform for Madison's approval, she was actually quite competent. Ashley presented their assessment protocol, outlining how they would evaluate the client's current functioning, identify specific treatment goals, and measure progress over time. Her natural creativity had been channeled into developing innovative assessment tools that went beyond standard questionnaires. Kevin discussed the evidence base for their chosen interventions, presenting research findings that supported their multimodal approach to treatment. His analytical skills had proven invaluable in synthesizing complex data into compelling arguments. Then, it was Sarah's turn. She stepped forward to present the actual treatment plan, and, for the first time since arriving at the university, she allowed her full expertise to show without reservation. Our treatment approach integrates several evidence-based modalities specifically adapted for military trauma, Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. We begin with stabilization techniques drawn from dialectical behavior therapy to help the client manage emotional regulation challenges. She advanced to a slide showing a detailed timeline of treatment phases. Phase 1 focuses on safety and stabilization. Many combat veterans struggle with hypervigilance and sleep disturbances that make it difficult to engage in therapeutic work. We use progressive muscle relaxation, controlled breathing techniques, and mindfulness practices to help restore the client's sense of physical and emotional safety. Professor Williams was leaning forward with obvious interest, and Sarah could see several classmates taking detailed notes. Phase 2 involves processing traumatic memories using EMDR therapy combined with narrative exposure therapy, Sarah continued. These approaches are particularly effective for veterans because they allow the client to maintain a sense of control while processing difficult material. A student in the front row raised her hand. How do you address resistance to treatment? Many veterans are reluctant to seek help. Sarah smiled, appreciating the sophisticated question. That's an excellent point. Military culture often emphasizes self-reliance and emotional stoicism, which can create barriers to treatment engagement. We address this by framing therapy in terms that align with military values, mission accomplishment, taking care of your team, maintaining operational readiness. The student nodded, clearly satisfied with the answer. We also incorporate peer support elements, Sarah continued, because veterans often trust other veterans more than civilian providers. The therapeutic relationship is framed as a partnership rather than a doctor-patient dynamic. Professor Williams interrupted with a question. Can you speak to the specific challenges faced by female veterans that might require modified approaches? Sarah's expression grew more serious. Female veterans face unique challenges that are often overlooked in standard treatment protocols. They're more likely to experience military sexual trauma, which creates complex layers of betrayal and trust issues. They also face reintegration challenges related to gender role expectations and lack of recognition for their service. She advanced to a slide that outlined gender-specific treatment considerations. Our approach includes specific modules addressing these issues, including group therapy opportunities with other female veterans and family therapy components that address the impact of deployment cycles on relationships and parenting. As Sarah spoke, she became increasingly aware that she wasn't just presenting academic research anymore. She was drawing on personal experience, sharing insights that came from lived knowledge rather than textbook learning. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. The final phase focuses on post-traumatic growth and meaning-making, Sarah concluded. Many veterans struggle with the transition from a mission-driven military environment to civilian life that can feel purposeless by comparison. We help clients identify ways to channel their skills and values into meaningful civilian pursuits. The classroom was completely silent as Sarah finished her portion of the presentation. Professor Williams was studying her with obvious fascination, while her classmates seemed to be processing the sophisticated level of knowledge they had just witnessed. Madison stepped forward for the group's conclusion, and Sarah noticed that her former antagonist had tears in her eyes. Working on this project has taught us that effective treatment requires more than theoretical knowledge, Madison said, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. It requires understanding the lived experience of trauma, the complexity of recovery, and the courage required to seek help. She looked directly at Sarah. It also requires recognizing that strength comes in many forms, and that some of the strongest people are those who choose healing over revenge, growth over bitterness, and service over self-interest. The presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, and Professor Williams stood up from her seat. "That was exceptional work," she announced to the class. "This group has demonstrated the kind of sophisticated clinical thinking and evidence-based practice that I hope to see from graduate students, let alone undergraduates." She looked directly at Sarah. The integration of military psychology research with civilian treatment approaches was particularly impressive. That level of specialization requires extensive knowledge of both military culture and trauma treatment protocols. As the class began to disperse, several students approached Sarah with questions about her presentation. Some seemed genuinely interested in the clinical content, while others were clearly curious about her background. Sarah found herself able to engage with both types of questions more comfortably than she had expected. Jake Martinez appeared at her side as the crowd began to thin. "Impressive presentation," he said quietly. "You seemed more relaxed up there than I've ever seen you." "It felt good to be able to use what I know," Sarah admitted. "I hadn't realized how much energy I was spending hiding my expertise." "That's the thing about authenticity," Jake replied. "It's exhausting to pretend to be someone you're not." After the other students had left, Professor Williams approached Sarah with an expression of professional interest. "I'd like to speak with you about your graduate school plans," she said. "Your presentation today suggests that you have knowledge and experience that could be tremendously valuable in the right doctoral program." Sarah felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. "I'm definitely interested in pursuing a PhD in clinical psychology. With your background, you should consider programs that specialize in military psychology or trauma treatment," Professor Williams suggested. "There's a tremendous need for clinicians who understand both the academic literature and the practical realities of military service." "I've thought about that," Sarah said, "but I wasn't sure how to present my military experience in academic contexts." Professor Williams smiled. "After today's presentation, I don't think you need to worry about that. You've demonstrated that you can integrate practical experience with academic rigor in sophisticated ways." As they talked about specific programs and application strategies, Sarah felt a sense of excitement about the future that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. For the first time, she could envision a career path that honored both her military service and her civilian aspirations. Later that evening, Sarah found herself at a coffee shop near campus, celebrating the successful presentation with her former group members who had somehow become actual friends. The transformation in their relationships still surprised her, but it felt genuine and sustainable. "I have a confession," Madison said as they sat around a small table with their drinks. "I looked up information about SEAL training after I found out about your background." Sarah raised an eyebrow. And I realized that everything I thought I knew about strength and toughness was completely wrong," Madison continued. "The physical requirements alone are beyond anything I could imagine, but the mental resilience required is on another level entirely." Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "I read about the psychological screening process. The dropout rate is incredibly high, even among people who are already elite athletes." "It makes me feel even worse about how we treated you," Ashley added quietly. "You could have destroyed us, but you chose not to. That takes more strength than fighting back would have." Sarah considered their words carefully. "The training is intense, but the most important thing it teaches you isn't about fighting. It's about thinking clearly under pressure, working as part of a team, and persevering when things get difficult." "Is that why you want to be a therapist?" Kevin asked. "To help other people develop those same skills?" "Partly," Sarah replied. "I've seen what trauma can do to people, and I've seen what recovery can look like when people have the right support and tools. I want to be part of that process." Madison leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "Do you ever miss it? The military life?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I miss the sense of purpose and the clarity of the mission. I miss working with people who would do anything for each other. But I don't miss the constant deployment cycles, the family separations, and the physical toll." "What made you decide to get out?" Jessica asked. "I realized that I could serve in different ways," Sarah replied. The skills I developed in the military, crisis management, working under pressure, helping people through difficult situations, those translate well to civilian careers. I wanted to explore other ways to make a difference. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself sharing more about her military experience than she had with anyone since transitioning out. The questions from her former antagonists were respectful and genuinely curious, and their obvious admiration was tempered with understanding of the sacrifices that elite military service required. "I have to ask," Madison said as they were preparing to leave, "when we were bullying you, did you ever think about, using your training on us?" Sarah laughed softly. "The thought crossed my mind once or twice. But that would have defeated the purpose of everything I was trying to accomplish here." "Which was what?" Ashley asked. "Learning to be a complete person," Sarah replied. "In the military, your identity is largely defined by your role and your unit. Coming to college was about discovering who I am beyond that identity." "And have you," Kevin asked, "figured out who you are?" Sarah smiled as she gathered her things. "I'm getting there. Turns out I'm someone who doesn't need to choose between being strong and being compassionate, between being confident and being humble, between honoring my past and building my future." As they walked across campus together, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her college experience had taken. What had started as an attempt to completely reinvent herself had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more satisfying. The integration of all aspects of her identity into a coherent whole. 6 months later, Sarah stood in Professor Williams' office holding an acceptance letter to a prestigious PhD program in clinical psychology with a specialization in military trauma. The program had been impressed not only by her academic record, but by her unique combination of practical experience and research interests. "I'm proud of you," Professor Williams said as she reviewed the acceptance package. "This program is perfect for your background and goals." Sarah nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction and anticipation. "Thank you for encouraging me to be honest about my experience. I don't think I would have had these opportunities if I had continued hiding my background. Authenticity opens doors that hiding never can," Professor Williams replied. "Your willingness to integrate your military experience with your academic goals has created possibilities that neither would have achieved alone." As Sarah left the office and walked across the campus that had become home, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. The bullying from Madison and her friends had been painful, but it had also forced her to confront the unsustainability of living a divided life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Saw your Facebook post about grad school acceptance. Congratulations. You're going to be an amazing therapist." Sarah smiled as she typed back, "Thanks. See you at graduation next week." The response came quickly. "Looking forward to it." "And Sarah? Thank you for teaching us what real strength looks like." As Sarah reached her apartment, she paused to look at a photograph on her desk, her graduating class from SEAL training, which she now kept face up where she could see it. Next to it was her acceptance letter to graduate school and a photo from their final group presentation. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt complete. She was no longer the quiet, nervous girl who had started college 2 years ago, nor was she simply the former SEAL who was pretending to be someone else. She was Sarah Chun, veteran, scholar, future therapist, and whole person. The integration of her identities had been messy and complicated, but it had been worth it. She was stronger now than she had ever been, not because she could dominate others, but because she had learned to be authentically herself in all circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she prepared to enter graduate school and eventually practice as a licensed therapist. But she would meet those challenges as her complete self, drawing on every aspect of her experience and training. And that, she realized, was what true strength looked like. Not the ability to overpower others, but the courage to be fully yourself and use that authenticity to lift others up. The nervous girl was gone, replaced by a confident woman who understood that the greatest battles are often fought not with weapons, but with wisdom, compassion, and the unshakable knowledge of who you really are. A comprehensive treatment plan that combined cutting-edge trauma therapy techniques with practical implementation strategies and measurable outcome goals. Sarah's military psychology expertise had provided the foundation, but Each group member had contributed meaningfully to the final product. Standing in front of their classmates and Professor Williams, Sarah felt a mix of nervousness and excitement that had nothing to do with public speaking anxiety and everything to do with the prospect of sharing work she was genuinely proud of. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Williams announced to the class, our final group will be presenting their treatment plan for complex PTSD in military veterans. As Sarah stepped forward to begin their presentation, she realized that this moment represented more than just an academic exercise. It was the first time she had publicly integrated her military experience with her civilian aspirations, the first time she had allowed her two identities to exist in the same space. And, for the first time in 2 years, that felt exactly right. The point, Sarah continued quietly, is that respect shouldn't be based on someone's ability to hurt you. It should be based on basic human decency. Madison's face was a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been fear. The power she had wielded over Sarah for months had been completely illusory, built on assumptions that had just been shattered. So what now? Madison asked, her voice smaller than anyone had ever heard it. Sarah gathered her materials with the same calm precision she brought to everything else. Now we finish our project. We have a presentation to give next week, and I intend to do excellent work regardless of our personal dynamics. As she packed up her laptop, Sarah paused to look at each of them one more time. And maybe, if you're interested, you might consider what real strength actually looks like. Professor Williams considered this. That's certainly an option, though at this point in the semester it would be difficult to rearrange. But I want you to know that if the situation becomes untenable, we can find alternatives. Sarah nodded gratefully. I think I can manage the remaining few weeks. I'm sure you can, Professor Williams said, studying Sarah with interest. You're much stronger than you give yourself credit for, you know. The comment hit closer to home than Professor Williams could have imagined. Sarah had spent so much energy hiding her true capabilities that sometimes she almost forgot who she really was underneath the carefully constructed facade. Thank you, Sarah said simply. As she walked back across campus, Sarah's mind turned to the group presentation they would be giving in just 2 weeks. Madison had made it clear that she expected Sarah to do the grunt work while taking minimal credit for the final product. But Sarah was beginning to think it might be time to demonstrate exactly what she was capable of contributing to the team. The thought both excited and terrified her. Revealing her true knowledge and capabilities would certainly improve their project, but it would also raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Still, she was tired of being underestimated and mistreated. Perhaps it was time for Madison and the others to learn that quiet strength could be far more formidable than loud aggression. Aren't feelings about the question, right? I was just trying to contribute to the academic discussion. Sarah looked up at her tormentor, meeting her eyes directly for the first time in months. Of course, academic discussion is important. Something in Sarah's tone made Madison pause for a moment, as if she had heard something unexpected beneath the quiet words. But the moment passed quickly, and Madison's cruel smile returned. Good. I'm glad you understand your place in these conversations. As Madison walked away with her friends, Sarah finished packing her bag with deliberate calm. She had spent years learning to control her reactions under far more extreme pressure than undergraduate psychology courses. The skills she had developed in the teams were serving her well in this very different kind of battlefield. But she was beginning to realize that sometimes the best way to help others understand strength was to demonstrate it clearly and unmistakably. The opportunity would come soon enough.